And there's a couple different arguments that are being used. One of the arguments is that this essentially falls, the reason why the federal government has the authority to do this, because this falls under the general welfare clause of the Constitution. So if you're familiar with the Constitution, the general welfare appears a couple of times in it, but we're most familiar when we talk about the preamble, where it's to promote the general welfare, and it's an explanation of why the federal government is being established in the first place. Here's the issue. Promote the general welfare cannot mean that the federal government gets to do whatever they think promotes the general welfare. And the reason why we know that is not what it means, the reason why we know it does not give that sort of unlimited power to the federal government, is because there would have been no reason to essentially write anything else with respect to amendments to the Constitution. There wouldn't have been a need to talk about the enumerated powers of the executive branch, the judicial branch, congressional branch, because if this was all just a question of, well, the federal government, as long as they decide it's within the general welfare of the people of the United States, therefore they can do it, right? Nobody interpreted it that way. Now, you might have some people like Alexander Hamilton argued one way about the general welfare clause in the Federalist Papers. You know, he basically gave what I think is the correct view of it, which is to say that it was a general concept to say that when the federal government made decisions, that they should be decisions that affect the entire body politic. That, but it's limited within the enumerated powers that the states have delegated to the federal government. So, for instance, you see this argument sometimes too with the supremacy clause, where people say, well, if the federal government's passed a law, then states are obligated to abide by it. Well, not necessarily. The reason why we have enumerated powers is to restrict the authority of the federal government, right? It's to set boundaries for where the federal government can act and where the federal government is not supposed to act. It's also why we have a 9th and 10th Amendment to the Constitution. 9th Amendment was in order to make sure that everyone understood that simply because a right might have been discussed in the Bill of Rights or somewhere else didn't mean that those were the only rights that the people had. And then the 10th Amendment was once again explaining that anything not expressly delegated to the federal government belonged to the states or the people. Okay, but now we have this kind of more, progressive interpretation of the general welfare clause, which is to say, and I see this from people on the left all the time on social media. The moment someone says where exactly in the Constitution does it give the federal government authority to do something, you immediately run to, oh, it's the general welfare clause. Again, that cannot be true. You didn't have any founders arguing for that. In fact, the anti-federalists were concerned about the general welfare clause in the Constitution because they thought it would be manipulated. And the people that supported the Constitution all wrote almost universally saying, no, that's not what it means. Clearly, that's not what it means, because if the general welfare clause had the sort of power that everyone was afraid of at the time, then there would have been no reason to have enumerated powers under the Constitution. There would have been no reason to really do anything else, because essentially the federal government would have had any sort of authority provided that a simple majority within the legislature believed it was serving the, quote, general welfare, right? So no, the general welfare does not justify what President Biden is trying to do right now. Another thing you'll see is with the interstate commerce clause. It's this idea that because the federal government has the power to regulate trade or regulate commerce among the several states, that essentially if it wants to come up with some sort of OSHA criteria, that it can tell you that, okay, if you do business and that business in some way affects other states or interstate commerce, therefore the federal government now has the authority to come in and make regulations that would govern your business. Now, once again, this is a complete misinterpretation of what the interstate commerce clause was designed to do. It was designed to make a free trade zone within the United States, and it was meant to cover very specific forms of transaction, but it wasn't meant to regulate anything that could fall under this new broad definition of commerce. And now we even see it because of the decision that we had in 1942 in Filburn, where the Supreme Court ruled, I believe, horribly and incorrectly, that the federal government could come in and essentially regulate your garden. Because if you were growing, I think it was either wheat or corn, if you were growing corn or wheat for your own consumption, then that means that you wouldn't go to the store to buy wheat. And if you'd gone to the store to buy wheat, maybe that wheat would have come from a different state, and therefore interstate commerce would be effective, and so the federal government could regulate it. Nobody in their right mind, when the interstate commerce clause was being written, interpreted it that way. Nobody interpreted it that way. This was a decision by a bunch of Supreme Court justices that got the hint when FDR threatened to pack the court and realized that if they didn't start giving a rubber stamp to some of his New Deal laws, that they might be in trouble. But there was absolutely no sound judicial reasoning in saying that simply because something could potentially affect interstate commerce, therefore the government could regulate it. Complete rejection of the actual interpretation and intention of the Interstate Commerce Clause. So, and you actually start to see some pushback on the Supreme Court. In fact, one of the things I'm hoping is that if the federal government does make an argument that they can essentially tell a business that if you have 100 employees, you have to require vaccinations, and they want to try to use Interstate Commerce Clause as justification for that, I'm really hoping this is a time for the Supreme Court to kind of put the reins back on this leftist progressive interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Because otherwise, if the current interpretation stands, it really does give the federal government way too much power with respect to how they can intervene in businesses and how you run your business. Because it used to be, at the very least, if you were concerned about falling under federal regulations or federal laws, you could do business exclusively within your state, and now you're not affecting interstate commerce in any way, shape, or form. Well, again, because of ridiculous decisions like Filburn, the federal government can come in and say, even if you have your business, and even if it's within the borders of a particular state, even if you do all your commerce within the borders of a particular state, because you doing your commerce within that state in some way, second or third order effects other commerce which could be interstate, therefore they can regulate you. Again, there's no end to that, right? That's a bottomless hole with respect to the reasoning that the court used. So I'm hoping that the Supreme Court will use this as an opportunity, if the federal government argues along lines of interstate commerce that they can regulate. I'm hoping the Supreme Court will use this as an opportunity to kind of rein that back in, because it's been a huge problem. All right, and this leads us to the last major argument that I've heard, that says that the federal government has the ability to do this, or the government in general has the ability to do this. And that is a Supreme Court case in 1905, and it was decided 7-2. It was called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And it said that public health measures like vaccination imposed by states are constitutional because, in essence, living in society comes with restrictions, including those pertaining to public health. Right, and so that was the argument that the Supreme Court made in Jacobson in a 7-2 decision. And that was all spurned on because you had a client, Jacobson came and basically was pushing back against mandates that the Massachusetts government was making, because him and his family actually had bad reactions to the vaccine. And so they didn't want to take it. And the Supreme Court ruled in that particular case that the government had the ability or the power to be able to impose this. Now, here's what's interesting. You fast forward to the Bell decision, which had to do with eugenics and forced sterilization. And it was Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. or Oliver Wendell Holmes who wrote the argument, the opinion, essentially using Jacobson versus Massachusetts to say that which extends to vaccines for public health can also extend to the fallopian tubes. And he ended it with saying 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So literally in this country, there were thousands upon thousands of people that were subjected to forced sterilization because public health experts had determined for them to procreate and to have children was bad for society overall, and so they could do that invasive process and prevent them from ever having children. All right, so Jacobson versus Massachusetts was the reasoning that was used in Jacobson was then reapplied in Buck versus Bell in 1927. And so the point I want to make here is that as we're engaging in this sort of argumentation, we need to be prepared to combat each one of these arguments, right? So let's kind of go through everything we talked about before. The General Welfare Clause does not provide this sort of justification of the federal government. Because again, the federal government is bound by the enumerated powers. It doesn't get to do whatever it considers is within the general welfare, right? It can only do those things that it is authorized to do. And when it does those things, it's supposed to only do it as it affects the general welfare, right? So even within the enumerated powers, the General Welfare Clause was actually a further restriction on federal power if you look at it through the light of enumerated powers. Because the states said, okay, here's your list of responsibilities. Here's the things you're going to do with respect to toll roads and with respect to going to war and with respect to maintaining the Army and Navy, et cetera. Like here's your duties and responsibilities. Okay, and as you do these duties and responsibilities, you are supposed to be keeping in mind that your job is not to execute this duty in such a way that only benefits one person, or only benefits some, or only benefits a particular region. You are supposed to do so with the general welfare of the entire country in mind. Right? So that's a proper interpretation of the General Welfare Clause, not just this idea that provided that 51% of the legislature and the president agrees, thinks it's okay, well then therefore do whatever you want. That's never what it meant. That is a completely unreasonable interpretation. Anybody that uses that argument is not familiar with the history of the general welfare clause, as well as the anti-federalist and federalist arguments that were taking place over the ratification of the Constitution, right? So you got to push him back toward, wait a second, general welfare clause is essentially bound by enumerated powers. All right, that's one of your arguments that you use in order to take the whole general welfare debate down. And again, if you want to reverse that on him, you say, oh, okay, great. So if Republicans were in control and Donald Trump was president, and he decided, he wanted to do something that you didn't like, or let's say he decided that, gosh, we're just gonna, we're going to completely get rid of funding for something that you approve of. And he said, well, I think it's in the general welfare. Or let's say he said, you know what, all federal employees are going to be required to sleep at Trump hotels whenever they travel. And he said, well, I figure that's within the general welfare. No, you wouldn't like that, right? You wouldn't like that because, again, it was there to restrict federal power, not to let them do whatever they want.